The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, carrying razor-sharp ice crystals that cut like knives against exposed skin. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, blurring the world into a storm of white. The temperature had dropped beyond lethal hours ago, and now, everything was quiet except for the unrelenting scream of the wind. Somewhere in that endless expanse of ice and death, a figure lay half buried beneath a thick layer of snow. Motionless, almost lifeless. Rykal's body refused to obey him. His limbs, once strong, now felt like useless weights dragging him toward an inevitable end. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one painful, each one a reminder that his body was shutting down. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, numbing his thoughts, stealing his strength. He had fought it for as long as he could, but there was no fighting this planet. No surviving the sentence handed down to him by his own kind. Exile. That was the punishment. Stripped of rank, stripped of honor, and thrown onto this frozen wasteland to die a slow, silent death. His crime? Mercy. A single moment of weakness, choosing to spare those who should have been slaughtered without question. His people saw it as betrayal, cowardice, a shameful stain on his warrior's bloodline. And so, they cast him out. A final breath, heavy with exhaustion, left his lips as his vision darkened. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how it ended, swallowed by the ice, forgotten by the universe. His mind drifted, his body sinking further into the cold embrace of the snow. He was ready to let go. Ready to. A noise. Not the wind. Not the storm. Something else. His instincts, dulled by exhaustion, flickered to life. A shape moved in the distance, blurred by the swirling snow. Footsteps crunched against the ice, slow and deliberate. It wasn't one of his kind. The silhouette was wrong. Too tall, too broad, moving with an unnatural ease in the deadly cold. His barely open eyes caught a flash of something. Dark, heavy clothing. A reflective visor. A human. The realization jolted through him like a shock of electricity, reigniting the fire of survival deep within his gut. He had been taught to despise them, to see them as inferior creatures, reckless and primitive. And yet, as the figure approached, the one undeniable truth burned brighter than all others. This human was alive, and Rykal was dying. The figure crouched beside him, brushing away the snow with gloved hands. A voice crackled through the cold, distorted by the helmet's built-in speaker. Still breathing, alien. The words barely reached him, but there was something in the tone. Not mockery, not cruelty, just curiosity, maybe even concern. A rough hand grabbed his arm, testing for movement, for resistance. Rykal's muscles barely responded. The human let out a grunt, adjusting his grip before lifting him with surprising ease. Rykal wanted to fight, wanted to snarl, to push away the unwanted help, but his body had other plans. He was too weak, too cold, too close to death to resist. As the human dragged him through the snow, Rykal's mind flickered between consciousness and darkness. The last thing he heard before the world faded completely was the human's voice, muttering through the storm. "Damn alien. I swear, if you die on me, I'm gonna be pissed." Rykal's mind drifted in and out of consciousness as the human pulled him through the relentless storm. The biting cold was still there, still seeping into his bones, but now something else pressed against him. Warmth. Not much, but enough to remind him that he wasn't dead yet. His vision blurred as he tried to lift his head, but his body refused to cooperate. All he could do was let himself be dragged, feeling the crunch of ice beneath them, the gusts of wind battering against his half-frozen skin. The human moved with a determined pace, his heavy boots leaving deep imprints in the snow. Each step was slow but steady, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Through the haze of his half-frozen thoughts, Rykal tried to make sense of it. Why was a human here? This planet was uninhabited, a death sentence for any living thing. His exile was meant to be final, with no chance of rescue, no hope of survival. Yet here he was, being pulled from his icy grave by one of the very creatures he was taught to despise. A metallic clang jolted him as they reached a structure, a small, makeshift shelter, barely large enough to be called a building. It was a survival pod, an emergency outpost likely left behind by some doomed expedition. The human kicked the door open, dragging Rykal inside before sealing it shut against the storm. Warm air hit him immediately. Not much, but compared to the ice outside, it was a shock to his frozen senses. His stiff muscles twitched as they tried to adjust, and the dull ache of circulation returning made him groan low in his throat. Yeah, I know it hurts," the human muttered, pulling off his thick gloves. He moved quickly, kneeling beside Rykal and reaching for something. A thermal blanket, a first aid kit, anything to keep him alive. "You better not die after all that trouble I just went through." Rykal's throat was too dry to respond, his vocal cords stiff from the cold. His body shivered violently, instincts battling against his fading strength. He hated this, hated feeling weak, hated being at the mercy of a human, but there was nothing he could do. A metal canister hissed as the human twisted it open, releasing heated oxygen into the air. The tiny space filled with a slightly warmer mist, pushing back the deep freeze that had taken hold of Rykal's body. The human leaned over him, studying him with sharp, assessing eyes. His helmet was off now, revealing a rugged face lined with exhaustion. Short, dark hair, a faint scar running across his cheek, and a look of stubborn determination that made it clear he wasn't about to let his new alien roommate die so easily. "You're a mess," the human muttered. "Frostbite on your hands. Skin's almost frozen solid. How the hell did you even make it this far?" Rykal let out a low, rattling breath, his teeth chattering too much to form words. He wanted to glare at the human, to show some semblance of defiance, but his body betrayed him. His limbs barely responded, his vision kept swimming, and the warmth pressing against his skin was his only anchor to reality. The human sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Right. You probably don't understand a word I'm saying. Doesn't matter. You need heat, fast." He stood, moving toward the back of the shelter where a small heating unit glowed dimly. Next to it was a survival bag, thick, insulated, meant to trap body heat in extreme conditions. Rykal recognized it instantly, and he also knew what the human was about to suggest. "Oh, you're not gonna like this," the human said, glancing back at him. "But unless you want to lose a couple of limbs, we gotta share." Rykal's eyes flickered with something: rage, defiance, desperation. The very idea of physical proximity with a human disgusted him. His species were warriors, proud and disciplined. They didn't rely on outsiders. They didn't. His body convulsed with another shudder, muscles clenching against the unbearable cold. He wasn't going to survive the night like this. The human crouched beside him again, holding up the survival bag. "Look, I get it. You probably hate this as much as I do. But I'm not about to let you freeze to death on my watch. So shut up and get in." Rykal barely managed to snarl, though it was weak, pathetic even. The human simply rolled his eyes and unzipped the bag, shoving it open. "You want to live or not?" he asked. "Because I don't have time for alien pride right now." Rykal clenched his jaw. He hated this. Every fiber of his being screamed against it. But his body was failing, and logic, cold, cruel logic, told him there was no other choice. With the last bit of strength he had left, he let the human pull him into the bag. The heat was immediate, shocking against his frozen skin. And then, as the human zipped it shut, the last thing Rykal registered before slipping into unconsciousness was the warmth of another body pressed against his own, keeping him tethered to life. Rykal woke slowly, his body sluggish, his mind caught in a strange haze between exhaustion and awareness. The first thing he noticed was the warmth. Unfamiliar, suffocating, but undeniably keeping him alive. It pressed against him, radiating through the thick insulation wrapped around him, seeping into his frozen muscles, and coaxing his body back from the brink of death. The second thing he noticed was movement, a slow, steady rise and fall beneath him. Breathing. A heartbeat. He stiffened. The realization came crashing down like a warship hitting the atmosphere. He wasn't just warm. He was pressed up against another living being. A human. Disgust curled in his gut before his mind could process anything else. His people had always viewed humans as reckless, primitive creatures, incapable of discipline or control. Yet here he was, locked in the same survival bag with one, absorbing its heat like some pathetic weakling. Rykal shifted slightly, trying to put distance between them, but the human grunted in response. "Quit moving," the human muttered, his voice rough with sleep. Rykal tensed. His instincts screamed at him to push away, to escape this humiliating situation, but his body had other plans. His limbs were still sluggish, his muscles aching from the cold's lingering effects. Worse, the moment he pulled away, a fresh wave of icy air slipped into the insulated space, instantly reminding him why he was here in the first place. The human exhaled sharply. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Rykal clenched his jaw, his sharp teeth pressing together in frustration. He wasn't used to this. Relying on someone else, especially a human, was the last thing he ever wanted. He had fought battles against their kind, stood on the front lines when his people clashed with them over territory disputes and resources, and now he was wrapped up with one like some fragile, helpless creature in need of rescue. It made his blood boil. But pride wouldn't keep him alive. Not here. Not now. The human shifted slightly, adjusting his position without much concern for personal space. Gotta say, didn't expect to be sharing a sleeping bag with an alien today. Guess the universe has a twisted sense of humor. Rykal said nothing. He focused on his breathing, forcing himself to stay still, to endure. The human let out a dry chuckle. Not much of a talker, huh? He shifted again, his voice laced with exhaustion, but still carrying that casual, irritating tone. "Figures. You don't look like the chatty type." Rykal's fingers twitched. His claws flexed slightly, a familiar reflex when his patience ran thin. The human sighed. "All right, fine. Silence it is." He fell quiet for a moment, then muttered, "At least you are still breathing." Rykal frowned. It was such an odd thing to say. Humans were known for their arrogance, their bravado. Why would this one care whether he was alive or not? He was supposed to be an enemy, an outsider, an exile with no worth left in the universe. Minutes passed in uncomfortable stillness. The human's warmth remained steady, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. Despite himself, Rykal could feel his strength returning. His fingers no longer felt numb. His chest didn't ache with every breath. He wasn't whole yet, but he was healing, because of this ridiculous, stubborn human. As the silence stretched, Rykal found his curiosity getting the better of him. His voice, still hoarse from the cold, finally rasped out a single question. "Why?" The human blinked, turning his head slightly. "Why what? Why help?" Rykal's throat burned from speaking, but he forced the words out. "You don't know me." The human let out a slow breath, thinking, "Guess I don't. But does it matter?" Rykal frowned. "It should." The human let out a tired chuckle. "Maybe to your people. But me? I don't leave people to die. Doesn't matter if they've got 2 legs, 4 legs, or scales." Rykal narrowed his eyes. Such a reckless way of thinking. No strategy. No logic. Just raw instinct, like an animal refusing to abandon its pack. "Stupid," Rykal muttered. The human snorted. "Yeah, well, maybe. But you're alive because of it, so you're welcome." Rykal let the words settle in his mind, but he couldn't argue with the truth of them. He had survived when he shouldn't have, all because of this human's strange, stubborn nature. The storm outside howled against the shelter, but inside the insulated warmth, Rykal's body continued to recover. He hated every second of this reliance, but for now, for survival, he would endure it. Tomorrow, he would find his strength again. Tomorrow, he would reclaim his dignity. But tonight, for the first time since his exile, he allowed himself to close his eyes without the fear of never waking up. The storm outside had finally begun to die down. The howling winds that had battered the small shelter for hours were now nothing more than a distant moan, fading into the cold silence of the frozen wasteland. The air inside was still thick with the recycled heat from the survival unit, making the space feel almost tolerable. Almost. Rykal stirred, his body aching as he shifted slightly within the sleeping bag. He was stronger now, no longer teetering on the edge of death, but his limbs still felt sluggish, his muscles stiff from the long exposure to the cold. The human beside him was still awake, though his breathing was slower, calmer, as if he were only half paying attention to the world around them. It had been quiet between them for a while now. Rykal had nothing to say, and the human seemed content to let the silence stretch. But something about the stillness felt wrong. It wasn't just the aftermath of the storm, or the lingering frustration at his own weakness. It was something else. Rykal's senses had dulled from the cold, but they were returning, sharpening like a blade being reforged. He could hear beyond the walls of their shelter now, past the wind, past the settling snow. And what he heard made his entire body tense. Movement. Not the shifting of ice, not the settling of the storm. Something deliberate. Slow. Predatory. His breathing stilled, every instinct suddenly on high alert. His people were warriors, trained from birth to recognize threats before they struck. Even now, weak and wounded, his instincts refused to fail him. The human must have sensed it too, because he let out a slow, cautious breath. "You hear that?" he murmured. Rykal didn't answer. He was already focusing on the sound, isolating it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A presence moving just beyond the walls of their temporary refuge. Something circling. Rykal forced his stiff muscles to move, pushing himself up slightly. The human shifted with him, careful not to make any sudden noise. His expression was tense, eyes sharp. He wasn't a fool. Good. That meant Rykal didn't have to waste time explaining the danger. The shelter wasn't built for combat. It was a simple survival pod, meant to keep a single person alive in extreme conditions. The walls were thin, reinforced only for insulation, not protection. If something was out there, they were vulnerable. Rykal's claws flexed instinctively. His body wasn't at full strength, but he would fight if he had to. He had no choice. The human reached for something in the corner. A rifle. Compact, military grade, designed for use in hostile environments. It was old but well maintained. He checked the ammo quickly, then gave Rykal a look. "Friend of yours?" the human asked, voice low. Rykal bared his teeth slightly. "No." Another sound outside. A soft crunch of snow. Closer now. The human's grip tightened on the rifle. "How bad are we talking?" Rykal didn't need to guess. He already knew. His people had warned of the creatures that roamed the ice. Predators that thrived in the endless cold, perfectly adapted to hunt in silence. They called them Ice Stalkers. "Bad," Rykal said simply. The human muttered something under his breath, something he didn't quite catch. Then, in one slow, careful movement, he reached out and shut off the heater. Instantly, the temperature in the shelter began to drop. Rykal hissed at the sudden cold, but he understood the strategy. Heat meant life. Heat meant prey. The creatures outside had likely been drawn to their presence, to the warmth bleeding out from the small structure. If they could make themselves invisible, at least for a while, they might have a chance. For a moment, the silence returned. The human's breathing slowed, matching Rykal's as both of them remained utterly still. Then something scraped against the outer wall. A sharp, deliberate sound. Claws against metal. Rykal's eyes narrowed. The creature was testing the structure, probing for weakness. It wasn't just some mindless beast. It was hunting. The human adjusted his grip on the rifle. His face was set in a calm, focused expression, his body coiled with tension but not panic. Good. Rykal didn't have the strength to protect him if he were foolish enough to make a mistake. Another scrape, then a low, guttural sound, almost like a breath. The creature was close now, just inches from them, separated only by thin metal. Rykal flexed his fingers, willing his strength to return faster. If the beast broke through, they would have seconds to react. Then, nothing. The silence stretched again, longer this time. The human's finger hovered near the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. He was waiting, just as Rykal was. Another minute passed. The wind howled again, but the scraping never returned. Finally, the human let out a slow breath. Gone. Rykal didn't answer immediately. His senses strained, listening beyond the storm, beyond the heartbeat pounding in his own chest. Then, a sound. Distant, faint, but wrong. A second presence. His eyes widened slightly. There wasn't just one. The human must have noticed his reaction because his body tensed again. What? Rykal barely had time to speak before the sound of tearing metal split through the night. The wall behind them buckled inward, a jagged claw ripping straight through the thin structure. The human cursed, rolling away just as the wall caved further, revealing a glimpse of gleaming white fur and hungry black eyes. The Ice Stalker had found its way in. Rykal didn't hesitate. His body was still weak, still recovering, but battle was in his blood, in his bones. He lunged, claws out, ignoring the screaming protest of his muscles. The creature snarled, its massive form pushing through the breach, fangs bared, breath misting in the freezing air. The human fired. A sharp, controlled shot straight into the beast's chest. The impact sent it stumbling, but not down. Not yet. Rykal tore into it, his claws finding purchase in thick fur, aiming for the throat. The creature shrieked, its massive frame twisting, trying to shake him off. It was fast, too fast. Even wounded, it lashed out with terrifying precision. A second gunshot rang out, this one straight into the creature's skull. It collapsed. Rykal barely had time to breathe before the human grabbed his arm, yanking him backward. Move. Another roar echoed from outside. There were more. Rykal staggered, his vision swimming for a second before he forced himself upright. His body was still weak, but there was no time to rest, no time to think. The human grabbed his gear, slinging the rifle over his back. We can't stay here. Rykal nodded once. Agreed. Outside, shadows moved against the snow. The predators hadn't given up yet. The human exhaled sharply. All right, alien, you fight. Rykal bared his fangs. I kill. The human smirked. Good. Let's not die then. Side by side, they braced for the next attack. The first beast had barely fallen before the others closed in. Through the broken wall, Rykal could see their pale forms moving against the snow. Ice Stalkers. Their massive, fur-covered bodies rippled with power, their dark, soulless eyes locked onto their next meal. Claws as long as daggers scratched against the frozen ground, and their sharp teeth gleamed under the moonlight. There were at least 3, maybe 4, circling the shelter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The human moved quickly, slinging his rifle across his back and reaching for a spare magazine. He had enough rounds for a fight, but not a prolonged one. This whole damn place is compromised, he muttered. We stay here, we die. Rykal already knew that. The shelter was never built to withstand an attack, especially not from creatures like these. It had barely held up against the storm. Now, with a gaping hole in its side, it was nothing more than a flimsy death trap. The human glanced at him. You on your feet. Rykal clenched his fists. His strength hadn't fully returned, but he had enough to fight. Enough to kill. He straightened, baring his sharp teeth in a silent challenge. Weak or not, he wouldn't die cowering. The human took that as an answer. All right then, we make a break for it. Another low growl rumbled through the night, vibrating through the ice itself. The creatures were testing them, creeping closer, waiting for a mistake. Rykal flexed his claws. Where? The human tilted his head toward the horizon. Couple clicks west. There's a ridge. It leads to a cave system. We get there. We can lose 'em. Rykal's gaze flickered toward the endless white ahead of them. The ridge wasn't visible from here, but if the human was right, it was their only option. Running across open ground was dangerous, but staying was worse. Another deep guttural snarl came from the side of the shelter. Then, in a sudden explosion of motion, the first Ice Stalker leaped. The human dove to the side just as the beast crashed through what remained of the wall, its powerful form sending debris flying. Rykal reacted on instinct, twisting away as a massive claw swiped toward his head, missing by mere inches. He lashed out, raking his own claws across the creature's face, drawing a streak of black blood. The Ice Stalker howled in fury, rearing back to strike again. A gunshot rang out. The human's rifle fired, the round punching into the beast's ribs. It let out an agonized screech, but didn't go down. "Go," the human shouted. Rykal didn't hesitate. He tore past the wounded creature, lunging toward the open snow. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he forced his legs to move. Survival first, pain later. The human was right behind him, boots slamming against the ice as he sprinted toward the distant ridge. Behind them, the remaining Ice Stalkers charged. Rykal risked a glance over his shoulder. They were fast, faster than he expected. Their thick fur and powerful legs made them unstoppable hunters in this environment. If they caught up, there wouldn't be time for a second fight. The human fired another shot over his shoulder, but he wasn't aiming to kill, just to slow them down. The creatures snarled but kept coming. The snow was uneven, slowing their pace. Rykal's muscles burned with every step, but he pushed forward, ignoring the fire in his lungs. The ridge wasn't far now. Then, the ground shifted beneath him. A trap. He barely had time to react before the ice beneath him collapsed, sending him plummeting into darkness. The fall was brief but brutal. He hit the ground hard, pain jolting through his body as he tumbled down a sharp incline of ice and rock. Snow filled his vision, and for a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breath, ragged and unsteady. Then, movement. A heavy thud echoed above. Something else had fallen. The human. He landed a few feet away, rolling onto his side with a pained grunt. His rifle had been knocked loose, but he was alive. He shook his head, dazed, then looked up. Rykal followed his gaze. Above them, at the edge of the hole, the Ice Stalkers stared down. For a moment, there was silence. The creatures sniffed the air, cautious. Then one leaped. Rykal moved. His body screamed in protest, but he didn't care. He lunged forward just as the first beast landed, slamming into its side before it could regain balance. They crashed into the ice, rolling in a tangle of claws and teeth. The creature snapped at him, barely missing his throat. The human grabbed his rifle and fired again, point blank. The bullet tore through the beast's skull, splattering black blood across the ice. It shuddered once, then went still. But there were more. A second creature dropped down, landing heavily a few feet away. Its massive frame blocked their only escape route. It snarled, then lunged. The human dodged, barely avoiding its crushing jaws. Rykal took the opening, slashing across its hind leg. The beast roared in fury, whirling to face him. That was a mistake. The human jammed his rifle against its head and fired. The Ice Stalker collapsed, twitching as blood pooled beneath its massive body. For a moment, neither of them moved. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their bodies aching from the battle. Then, silence. The other stalkers hadn't followed. The creatures were smart. They knew a losing battle when they saw one. Finally, the human exhaled sharply. Well, that sucked. Rykal ignored him, scanning the cave around them. The fall had led them into a tunnel, dark, deep, but possibly their way out. The human followed his gaze, then sighed. Great. More underground death traps. Rykal turned to him, breathing steady again. Better than dying up there. The human smirked, shaking his head. You know what? I think I'm starting to like you, alien. Rykal huffed. Unfortunate. The human grinned. Yeah, let's move. Side by side, they stepped deeper into the tunnels, leaving the bodies of the fallen beasts behind. The real fight for survival had only just begun. The tunnel stretched into endless darkness, the cold stone walls pressing in on either side as Rykal and the human moved cautiously forward. Their breath came in slow, measured exhales, the only sound apart from the distant howling of the wind above. The ice had swallowed them whole, and now their only choice was to push forward and hope this path led somewhere other than an early grave. Rykal's body ached with every step. His muscles were still weak from the cold, but adrenaline had carried him through the fight. Now, with the immediate danger behind them, exhaustion threatened to drag him down, but he wouldn't allow it. He refused to show weakness, not in front of the human, and not in front of himself. The human, Mason, he had called himself, walked beside him, his rifle held at the ready. His face was still marked with tension, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression. Not fear, something more calculating. How deep do you think this goes? Mason finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Rykal's gaze flicked to the jagged walls of the tunnel, tracing the layers of ice and rock. Deep enough that no one finds our bodies if we take the wrong path. Mason snorted. Real comforting. Rykal said nothing. There was no need for false hope. He had long since learned that empty reassurances were nothing but a slow poison. Survival required realism, not optimism. They walked for several minutes, their steps cautious, their eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The tunnel was unnervingly quiet. The air was thick with trapped cold, untouched by the warmth of the surface. Every so often, the ice groaned above them, a distant, unsettling reminder that they were walking beneath tons of frozen death, and a single shift in pressure could seal their fate forever. Then, Rykal heard something else, a faint, rhythmic sound. Not the wind, not the ice. Dripping. He stopped abruptly. Mason noticed and halted beside him, following his gaze into the darkness ahead. You hear that? Mason asked. Rykal gave a slow nod. Water. That meant warmth, a possible way out, or something worse. Mason adjusted his grip on the rifle. Could be a geothermal vent. Some of these ice planets have underground heat pockets. If we're lucky, that means a path to the surface. Rykal didn't believe in luck, but he wasn't going to ignore an opportunity either. He stepped forward, following the sound with quiet, measured movements. Mason kept close beside him, his boots barely making a sound against the frozen ground. As they moved deeper, the tunnel widened slightly, opening into a cavernous space. The dripping sound grew louder. Then, as they stepped forward, the ground shifted. Rykal barely had time to react before the ice beneath them gave way. The world lurched as heat and Mason plummeted downward, the cavern floor crumbling into a steep, slick descent. Rykal snarled, claws digging into the ice, trying to slow his fall. Mason let out a sharp curse as he tumbled beside him, scrambling to grab onto anything solid. They hit the ground hard, rolling across the uneven ice before coming to a painful stop. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Mason groaned. I swear, if I fall one more damn time. Rykal pushed himself up with a snarl. His body protested every movement, but he forced himself to his feet. Get up, human. Mason let out a breath, rolling onto his side before pushing himself upright. His rifle had been knocked loose again, but he retrieved it quickly, giving Rykal an irritated look. Yeah, I'm up. Rykal ignored him. His eyes were already scanning their new surroundings. The cavern they had fallen into was massive, stretching high above them, the ceiling glittering with ice formations. But the most important thing was what lay ahead: a river, or at least something close to one. A slow-moving stream of dark water cut through the cavern floor, its surface teeming faintly in the freezing air. Mason exhaled sharply. "Damn, you were right. There's heat down here." Rykal crouched near the water's edge, dipping 2 fingers into the liquid. It was warmer than the surrounding ice. Not much, but enough to indicate there was some kind of geothermal activity beneath them. If they followed it, it might lead to an exit. But something about it felt wrong. He sniffed the air, his sharp senses picking up something underneath the frozen scent of the cavern. Something faint, metallic. Mason must have noticed his hesitation. "What?" Rykal withdrew his hand, shaking the water off. "Something else is down here." Mason frowned. "Like what?" Rykal didn't answer immediately. He stood, his eyes scanning the cavern again. The air was too still. The silence felt unnatural. And then, a shadow moved. Not a trick of the light. Something was in the cavern with them. Mason reacted instantly, raising his rifle. "Talk to me, alien. What am I looking at?" Rykal's body went rigid as his eyes locked onto the movement near the far side of the cavern. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion, barely visible against the ice. But it was there, watching, waiting. Then, the silence shattered. A low guttural growl echoed through the cavern, vibrating through the ice itself. The sound was deep, resonating like something massive had just exhaled from the depths of the dark. Mason tensed. "That's not another Ice Stalker, is it?" Rykal's claws flexed. No, this was something worse. The shadows moved again, shifting closer. Then, for the first time, Rykal saw it. A shape, towering and grotesque, emerged from the darkness. It wasn't covered in thick fur like the Ice Stalkers. Instead, its body was slick and armored, its form glistening under the dim light of the cavern. Its limbs were long, spindly yet unnaturally powerful, ending in razor-sharp claws that scraped against the ice with every step. And its eyes. Black, empty, starving. Mason inhaled sharply. "What the hell is that?" Rykal didn't answer. His mind raced, sifting through every memory, every piece of knowledge his people had about this planet. They had spoken of the Ice Stalkers. They had never spoken of this, which meant they had never lived long enough to. The creature's mouth parted, revealing rows of jagged teeth beneath its chitinous shell. It let out a slow, rumbling hiss, its breath fogging in the cold air. Then it lunged. Rykal reacted instantly, shoving Mason out of the way as the creature's massive claws slammed into the ground where they had stood. Ice shattered beneath the impact, shards flying in all directions. Mason rolled, raising his rifle. He fired. The bullet struck the creature's side, but instead of flesh, it hit hardened plating, ricocheting off with a sharp clang. Rykal cursed. Bullets wouldn't be enough. The creature moved fast, its grotesque form slithering across the ice like a nightmare-given shape. It wasn't just hunting them. It was toying with them. Mason gritted his teeth. "Tell me you've got a plan, alien." Rykal bared his fangs, his claws flexing. He didn't need a plan. He just needed to kill it first. The creature moved like living darkness, its grotesque, armored body shifting unnaturally across the icy cavern floor. Rykal barely had time to react before it lunged again, its massive claws swiping through the air where he had stood mere moments before. He twisted to the side, his instincts the only thing keeping him alive as the beast's unnatural movements sent a shiver through his already weakened body. Mason fired again, this time aiming for what looked like a weak spot in the creature's plating, just beneath the jaw, where its thick armor split into jagged, overlapping sections. The bullet struck home, but instead of piercing through, it buried itself halfway in before stopping. The creature let out a horrible, clicking snarl, its black eyes narrowing as if the attack had been nothing more than an inconvenience. "Of course it's bulletproof," Mason growled, ejecting the spent cartridge and reloading. "Because why would anything on this damn planet be easy?" Rykal didn't bother responding. He was already moving, already analyzing, already searching for an opening. The beast was fast, but it had a pattern. Each time it attacked, it lunged forward in a straight line. No side-to-side movements, no sudden shifts. That meant it relied on overwhelming force, not agility. That was a weakness, and Rykal would exploit it. He darted forward, claws extended, forcing himself toward the creature rather than away from it. Mason barely had time to curse before the alien warrior threw himself underneath the beast's outstretched arm, sliding across the icy surface and raking his claws against its softer underbelly. The impact wasn't enough to kill, but it was enough to hurt. The beast shrieked, an ear-piercing sound that echoed off the cavern walls. It reared back, lashing out blindly, its elongated limbs striking at nothing but ice. Mason saw the opening and fired again, this time aiming for the same point Rykal had just wounded. The bullet struck true, sinking deeper into the exposed flesh beneath its shell. Black ichor splattered across the ice, sizzling as if it were burning the very ground it touched. The creature twisted violently, its massive tail slamming into Rykal's side and sending him flying across the cavern. He hit the icy wall with a bone-rattling impact, pain lancing through his ribs. Mason fired again, emptying his magazine into the beast's face, trying to keep it distracted. But Rykal didn't stay down. Pain was nothing. Pain meant he was still alive. He forced himself to his feet, growling through gritted teeth, his sharp claws flexing. Enough. He wasn't going to let this thing keep them trapped here. He had already been exiled, already been left for dead. He refused to let some mindless beast decide how his story ended. His gaze snapped toward the cavern ceiling. Icicles. Massive ones. They clung to the rock high above, hanging like frozen daggers, some large enough to skewer a warship. If he could bring them down, the weight alone would be enough to crush the creature. But he would need a big impact. "Mason." Rykal barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The human, still firing, didn't look away. "Kinda busy, alien." "The ceiling. Shoot it." Mason spared him a quick, incredulous glance. "Are you insane?" "Shoot it." Mason swore under his breath, but did as he was told. He lifted his rifle, took aim at the largest formation of icicles above the beast, and fired. The first shot shattered at a smaller icicle. The second cracked the largest one down the middle. The creature, momentarily confused by the noise above, let out another snarl, its black eyes darting between its prey and the ceiling. Rykal didn't give it a chance to react. He charged, launching himself forward in one final desperate attack. His claws dug into the beast's wounded underbelly again, slashing deeper this time. The beast let out a horrible screech, staggering backward, right under the weakened icicles above. Mason took his final shot. The massive icicles broke free, crashing down like frozen spears. The first one struck the creature's back, piercing through its thick armor like a blade through soft flesh. It let out a final, inhuman scream, its body writhing in agony. The second icicle followed, then a third, each one driving it lower, lower, until it finally stopped moving. Silence. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Then Mason let out a long, shaky breath. Holy hell. Rykal pushed himself up slowly, ignoring the pain lacing through his ribs. He staggered toward the fallen creature, staring down at the lifeless, frozen husk. It was dead. Finally. Mason let out a dry, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. That was the stupidest plan I've ever gone along with. Rykal smirked, wiping black ichor from his claws. And yet, we live. Barely, Mason muttered, reloading his rifle. He exhaled sharply, glancing around the cavern. So, now what? Rykal looked toward the path ahead. The underground river still flowed, still leading deeper into the unknown. The air here was warmer, the temperature rising as the geothermal heat pulsed beneath the ice. "There's a way out," Rykal said. "We follow the river." Mason gave him a look. "And that won't lead us to more death." "Everything leads to death," Rykal said simply. "Better to choose our path than wait for it to find us." Mason rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he adjusted his rifle strap and nodded toward the dark tunnel ahead. "Then let's move." Rykal took one last glance at the fallen beast. He didn't know what it was, didn't know how long it had lurked beneath the ice, waiting for prey. But it didn't matter now. He had survived. For the first time since his exile, he felt something unfamiliar. Not just relief, not just the primal satisfaction of winning a battle. Purpose. Without another word, he turned and walked beside Mason into the darkness, leaving the frozen cavern and the ghosts of his past behind.